Hi, I'm Dean Aloysiadis, and the purpose of this tutorial is going to be to talk to you about choosing, designing and milling a crown restoration on an upper molar. Some of you may already be familiar with this primescan initial screen. However, for those of you who are not, I will be expanding on the various features as we go through this tutorial. Here we have the upper model of the arch, and we are going to select the upper left 6 as the crown that we are going to restore, and we'll then start talk about the various selections that we will have in the indication tabs over here. Let's start with the administration phase. Here we can select the restoration type. In this case it's going to be a crown, but it automatically defaults to auto detect. We can then select a bridge if that's what the plan of action is going to be. We can also select an implant, and we can also select a implant drilling guide based on the CEREC and primescan parameters. These two down here is for smile design, which will be subject to a later video, and this icon here is to use the articulator. Again, this is going to be the subject of another video. In the restoration tab we have auto detect, but we also have this missing button. For the most part, just ignore it. It's only there to annotate if a tooth is missing and the space is closed. So ignore it. It will cause more problems than it solves. The default position in design mode is biogeneric individual, and here CEREC will choose how to design and shape your crown based on the parameters of the particular restoration and of the particular material that has been chosen. Let us now discuss biogeneric copy. Here we want to restore the upper left 4, and what we're going to do is we are going to copy the size and shape of the upper left 5 and then use that as our template for restoring the upper left 4. So the next selection is copy and mirror. Here it does what it says on the tin. We copy and mirror the contralateral tooth to use that as a template to restore a particular tooth. We can now move on to material selection, and here you can see the variety of manufacturers and materials that are available to us. Here we have chosen Ivoclar and an Empress crown as our material choice. So let us now start selecting what we are going to do. So in restoration type, as I said before, it defaults to auto detect. The system will detect whether it's a crown, inlay, onlay, veneer, whatever. You can change this later on in other screens if you so desire. I automatically leave it to auto detect. Now that we have chosen the upper left 6 as our restoration, we can now go into the case details. As you can see here, and this is totally editable by clicking on the pencil icon. And once we've clicked on that, we can use the drop-down menus to edit the various parameters and properties of the materials that we are going to be using. So once we've opened up our case, you can see the restoration type is auto detect. We can then change it to the various crowns, inlays or whatever. By generic individual, we're leaving it on that, and then the materials, again we can go through and choose our materials, and the device is just a milling device that you're going to be using for your milling of your restoration. Once we're happy with that, click on the tick box and move on to the next phase. So the next phase being the acquisition phase. This is where we are going to capture the data which will allow us to design, plan and mill our restoration. Here we are just capturing the upper jaw, and we just run our camera from the posterior of the mouth right to the anterior. I tend to prefer to capture at least a half an arch just past the central incisor. It just makes planning and the restoration design much easier later on. And it's a very steady motion to capture all of the details that you need. The system is quite intelligent enough not to gather or to at least delete extra material. You can rotate your image once you stop scanning. You can see where you have voids, where you have gaps, and you can just recapture those particularly in critical areas such as the contact points around your crown, such as here. And you just run your scanner once again inside the mouth, and you capture that detail. Once you're happy with all of that, then of course you can move on to the next phase. At this point it's worth just stopping and reevaluating your scan, and if necessary you can use the tools icon over here to cut or edit your model, although this can be done much more effectively in the next phase, the model phase, and again we can discuss that later on. As you can see, I'm using the cut tool to cut away these extra bits of information that was scanned from the models. These are just totally superfluous, totally unnecessary, and are just a waste of data. So I'm quite happy to edit it at this stage and in this screen. Once we're happy with that, we can then move on to the next phase, which is the model phase. So we'll now allow the software to do its thing. It'll generate a model, align it up into the model axis, and we'll just talk about this in just a sec. The screen here is the set model arch. Here we will align the segment that we have scanned into this graphical representation of the arch. Here obviously we're using an upper model, so we will have three grade areas, the anterior segment, the middle segment, and the posterior segment. And what we want to do is just align our model so that the teeth fall into these representative areas. Over here we can set up our incisal edges, and normally up here we will have set our midline. As you can see, this is much more effective if you have, and this is why I said before, you should really be scanning at least half an arch and including the anterior segment. We will rotate it and move it so that everything lines up, as you can see here, and this allows the software to know where the teeth are. It allows it to plan the paths of insertion, and it also allows us to make a realistic restoration. And moving the model is really a case of using left and right mouse clicks, or if you're using the trackpad, you can use a trackpad, or you can use the mouse on screen, as you can see here. Once we're happy with it, we just click on OK, and we then move on to the next phase, where with the model axis set, we now move on to the draw margin area using the tools on the top right side here. I usually leave it on magnetic, whereby the software itself will decide where the margin edges are. This is a really quick way to delineate your margins, and then what I will do is I will move on to the manual, and then I will rotate and zoom into various areas where I think there may be a problem. As you can see here, there's a bit of a dip, and again with the manual I will just click on the edges and then just rerun my line and just make it as smooth as possible. Okay, and once we're happy with that, we just keep rotating and zooming in and out until we just get our margin delineation exactly on the margin edge. It's worth spending a few minutes doing this properly. That way you will almost certainly get a lovely proposal based on where your margins are. This is also vitally important to make sure that you have nice prep margins. So I would suggest that when you're working and doing your preps, I would suggest that you work under magnification. It makes your life so much easier. So now that we have a nice margin, we simply click on the arrow to move into the next phase, which is the set insertion axis. And here we can rotate the model until you have very little or no yellow at all. Yellow would signify undercuts. If you're happy with your insertion axis, you can, of course, if you want, go into the preparation analysis, and here using the various tools on the right hand side, you can look at the various aspects of your prep. We will leave this for another tutorial at another time, but again, it's a useful tool to analyze the quality of your work. Here we can now move on to the design phase simply by clicking on the design, and we let the software design our crown for us. Again, we have a variety of tools here which I will analyze as we go through and tell you how to use each one. The majority of the time the software does a pretty good job of deciding and designing a crown. If you want to look at shade analysis, there is a shade analysis tool. Again, a useful little tool for choosing your base shade of your restoration. The next stage in the design process is to open up the tools menu by clicking here, and that just gives us a whole array of tools that we can use to edit, modify and design our crown. With the tools menu open, we have a variety of tools: form, move, shape, recalculate, biogenetic variation, reduce, and of course adjust contacts. And I'll be discussing these as time goes on. When it comes to editing the restoration, I tend to start off with the big tools first, such as the move, the shape tool, and then I will move on to the form tool. The form tool, you can regard it as some small finessing work that needs to be done to your restoration, whereas the shape and move tool will affect bigger global changes to your restoration. So therefore they are the sensible ones to do and use first. The recalculate tool I will tend to use if, after all is said and done, I look at my proposal, really don't like it, just hit recalculate it and the software will produce yet another design proposal for you. By selecting the biogeneric variation tool, allows the software to give you proposals where there is more surface anatomy, more surface variation, and therefore to make your tooth or your restoration look a little bit more natural compared to the initial design proposal. The reduce tool I don't tend to use very often. It's there primarily for techniques where you want to do a veneering technique. So you design your restoration, then you reduce it, and then you will produce a coping, and onto that coping you can then add more porcelain and more layers and more characterization and build it up by hand. The adjust contacts tool allows you to, or allows the system to reset and redefine all the contacts points, whether it's occlusal, mesial, distal, based on the parameters that are already set in the system. Again, a very useful tool. Using the form tool is akin to using the wax knife when we were designing and making crowns and dentures at dental school. You use your wax knife to build up and add wax in certain areas, and then you can use the smooth tool to smooth off those areas and just blend the wax in and make it look a lot smoother and shinier. And of course we can still use our wax knife to take away little bits of wax. And the form tool works in exactly the same way. We click on the add button here, we can change the cursor size, or in other words the amount of wax that we can add, and then we just add it onto the, in this case, the occlusal surface of the tooth. You can see I'm just basically depositing layers and layers of wax in inverted commas, and you can see it just builds it up. If I don't like it, quick click the reset button and it goes back to normal. The smooth tool here, we just use that to smooth out all those tool marks, as it were, and it smooths out high bits and it smooths out low areas and just blends everything in quite nicely. It's a blending tool. The smooth tool is also very useful when we look at it on the intaglio surface and we look at the contact points. We can look at the contact points and then just use the smooth tool to smooth off those contact areas. They were green and we just smooth them out. And because the model itself is acting as a mask, it's very selective and it will only reduce the areas that you see. We can turn off the restoration and we can see the minimal thickness parameters here, and you can see how thick the restoration is, and I tend to leave that turned on. Turn the restoration back on and you can see the overall design. By turning off the upper model, you can just look at your restoration in 3D, you can rotate it, look at the contact points, and again you can use your add smooth and remove tool to add smooth and remove areas again of porcelain. And if you remove too much, as is being done here, it takes us back down to the minimal thickness parameters. Oops, too far, hit the recalc button and it just goes back to normal. Again, if you want to add in certain areas, just click on the add button and we can just add small layers of porcelain oil, and you can see how we can build out the contact points. And the darker the color, in this case red, tells me I've got a very heavy contact point, as you can see by the rather bizarre looking restoration. And if I turn on the upper model, you can see what it looks like. And if I look on the fitting surface or below, then again I can use my smooth tool to smooth that area out, remove all the red and the yellow, and take it back down to a green, or I tend to prefer blues. And then you just keep doing that until you get a nice looking restoration and it all looks normal and natural. And sometimes it doesn't always work, so you can use your remove tool just to take off specific areas. And if we don't like it, once again, go back to undo and you're back to square one again. Okay, a very useful little tool and technique. Earlier on you saw the minimal thickness, and I tend to leave that turned on. Let's now look at the shape tool. The shape tool allows for big global changes in our restoration design, and I do tend to use it before I will use the shape tool. Having said that, if the initial proposal is pretty decent, then I don't need to use it. As you can see from the menu here, we have anatomical and circular. We also have 2 direction and 4 direction, as well as the size. And all of these things can be changed to suit our purposes. Anatomical will allow you to change things like the whole buccal surface, the whole mesial contact surface, occlusal surface, fissure contact heights. Again, a very useful tool for effecting big changes. The circular tool tends to allow a little bit more fine-tuned control, and by selecting that you can also select the size of the area they're going to change, and again it allows you to pull out areas that you want to increase, decrease, to make your restoration look much more natural and fit into the space that we have. So let's see now what happens when we use the anatomical tool. We select the area, and by moving the cursor up and down we stretch that restoration, and again we can turn off the upper jaw and we can see what the effect is by pulling out the whole highlighted area, as you can see here. Again, a very useful tool. If we don't like it, once again reset it, goes back to the original design. The circular tool, again, as I said before, we can change the size of the area, as you can see here, and then we can pull it out to increase the contact or the strength of the contact point. And as you can see here, you can go backwards and forwards. Again, I prefer to leave it into the blue turquoise. And again, you move portions of the cusps up or down. Again, what you're trying to do is make it look as natural as possible. Biogeneric variation, as I mentioned before, allows you to select different types of anatomy and surface structure of the restoration, and you can see by sliding the cursor or the slider backwards and forwards, it just changes the proposal and it can make it look more natural or less natural, as the case may be. Once again, if we don't like it, magically enough, you can just hit the reset button and go back to your original restoration. So you're not really losing anything at all by doing that. The next tool is the reduction or the reduce tool. Again, I don't tend to use this very much or at all in my day-to-day practice. If I was to do veneering techniques whereby you just want a coping made, you can reduce the overall amount of material that is on there, and then the proposal is redesigned and you just get a shell milled, which you can then build up layers of porcelain by hand. This tool will come in more use if you want to add a screw hole if you're doing an implant restoration, but again, that's for another day. It's another headache for another day. For the time being, and in 99% of the work that I do, I just ignore it, don't bother with it. The contacts we have here allows us to add just the contacts. We have the mesial contact, which we're adjusting, and what the system is doing is it knows how strong my contacts are based on the parameters of the material, and it just redesigns and it just adds or takes away material in those areas. Normally you will have distal, occlusal and mesial highlighted, but in this case there is no opposing model, so of course there is no occlusal adjustment to be made. Now that we are happy with our restoration, we are going to go to the single most important thing in the entire process. This little icon up here, the save button. You have spent ages designing and finessing your restoration, and every now and again, like any other piece of software or any other piece of IT equipment, it can throw a glitch and it can sometimes crash. So get into the habit of every design phase, every change of phase, just use the drop down menu, go into the save icon and just save your work. It will save you a lot of pain and tears in the long run. So now that we have designed and saved our restoration, we can move on to the manufacture phase. We simply select the manufacture, or we click on one of these arrows down here to move us into the next stage. Make sure your CEREC machine and your CEREC milling unit is turned on, otherwise you get this error. But once we've got that, we have again a selection of tools. We have the sprue tool, where we can move the block and move the sprue out of important contact areas, such as the mesial contact or distal contact areas. And again, we can move the block up or down to suit our purposes. For the most part, move your block so that the sprue is not in a vitally important area such as a mesial or distal contact point. I tend to try and have my sprues on the palatal aspect where they're not going to be visible after they've been reduced. Again, we can play with the minimal thicknesses, we can hide things, we can move things, we can check the fitting surface of our restoration. But for the most part, once we've gotten to this phase, everything should be ready to go. One final check of the fitting surface, make sure we're happy with it. We're looking for any areas of undermill or overmill. We can zoom in, and as you can see here, we've got a little bit of minimal thickness shining through. To be quite honest, that's too small to worry about, but we can go back and adjust it. And once we're ready, once we're happy, we can just crack on and go to our restoration. I've now actually turned on the CEREC milling unit, and as you can see here, we've chosen an IPS Emax, Ivyclad Emax crown. It's a size 12 that we can change to the block size that we're going to use. And again, you're just going to select the block size that A, fits your restoration, and B, that you have in your drawer. Again, you can see here there's various items that we can play with and adjust, and again we'll talk about those in due course. So I'm going to select, as you can see here from the drop down menu, there's a variety of materials we can use or sizes. The blocks that I have is a C14, so I've just selected an Emax C14, and you can see the block changes. It doesn't change the restoration, it just changes the block. And we're pretty much ready to go. We can choose between, depending on the restoration, we can choose between fast and fine. And the occlusal offset, I tend to either have on 0, or I tend to turn it down to minus 25. And again, there's an explanatory window here that tells you what everything means. But for the most restorations that you will do, I would suggest that you set your occlusal offset to minus 25, unless you're doing katana or zirconia, in which case leave it to 0. That offset allows for adjustment, it allows for the chattering of the burrs, and it just makes sure your restorations will fit. As you can see here, we've chosen an Emax restoration, but if I want to change it, I go back to the administration phase, and I can click on the edit icon here and go down to the drop down menu and change it to anything that I want really, a tetric restoration, an Empress restoration, or even zirconia restoration. Here we've chosen an Empress as opposed to an Emax. When I go back into my design phase, you will see that my restoration has changed. We've got a lot more blue shining through, and that is because the minimal parameters of the two different materials are actually different. And again, we can go back into restoration parameters just for this particular situation and change them to something that suits us. And here I can change my spacer, which is basically your thickness of cement around the radial surface. We can change the spacer on the occlusal surface, and again for most of these I just leave them to about 90 or 100 microns. Again, you can play with the contact strengths, and as you move it you can see it changes color. I tend to leave mine on to 25 microns, keeps it nice and blue. The minimal thickness for this particular restoration is down to 1500 microns. You can adjust it, and I would suggest for a Empress you can change it to about 1000 microns on the radial and about 1500 to 1000 to 1500 on the occlusal. This will only affect this particular restoration's parameters. It will not affect the global restorations. Again, these are things that you should adjust before you spend time designing your software, because as soon as you start moving these sliders, the software will actually redesign your restoration. If you just spent 15-20 minutes designing something and then you go in here and it throws it all out the window, you're not going to be a very happy bunny. Once you're happy with all of that, move on to the next stage, where you can play with the morphology of the tooth. And again, this is something you want to do before you start anything. And again, you can choose from a variety of teeth. There's a tooth database, Vita, etc. And then you can just choose the forms based on those. And again, you can play with those to your heart's content. I tend to leave them to the default ones. You can change the tooth morphology. So for example, you have a molar tooth that's in a premolar size, or vice versa. You can just change the size and shape of the tooth to fit your space. So you've got lots of flexibility here. For the most part, leave things well alone. It's very useful if teeth have drifted into spaces and the proposal doesn't quite work. Okay, so go back to in the edit restoration phase here, and as you can see, we've got a lot of minimal thickness showing up. And again, what we will do is we will use our various tools, the form, the move, the shape, etc., or the recalculate, to go back in and change things. And once we've changed it, we can get the design, and we've got the proposal that we want to actually mill. I'll just hit recalculate here, hit the apply icon, and lo and behold, after a few spinny seconds, you can see I've got a lovely restoration which satisfies all of my criteria. A couple of minimal areas that need to be tweaked and adjusted, and again I can use the various tools such as the form tool to play with these various small areas. If they were bigger, then I would use the move tool or the shape tool, and again I'm quite happy with that overall. Just those minimal areas there, just by adding a little bit more porcelain until they disappear. And then once that's been done, we can then move on to the manufacturing phase. So a couple of rotations, make sure we're happy with everything, click manufacture, and we go back to our manufacturing window. Make sure we've selected the right milling. We've got fast and fine. I'm quite happy with fine. Select the size of block, hit start, and that's about it really. Once the milling machine starts, it will make you a new crown and produce your new crown in about, again depending on the size and the material, in about 10 minutes. So thank you for listening, thank you for watching, And if you have any questions, please email me and I'll be more than happy to answer them. Thank you.